Good morning, everyone. Welcome to join the second day of Norwich University's 2022 Peace and War Summit that deals with the topic of Russia, in person or virtually. My name is Yang Mo-koo, Associate Professor of Political Science and Associate Director of Peace and War Center at Norwich University. I am extremely honored to serve as Executive Director for this year's summit. Yesterday, Governor Phil Scott and two keynote speakers, 11 scholars, and 3 Norwich and UVM students, they addressed many different dimensions of the Russian and international issues. Through those summit sessions, we could promote our understanding of the current global order, seriously disrupted by Russia's provocative acts. Today, we will have 2 other roundtable discussions, which focus on Russian domestic politics and foreign policy, as well as U.S. strategy toward Russia. I hope these sessions will help current world leaders and future leaders here to find peaceful and reasonable solutions to extremely tough global challenges we are currently facing. Thank you so much for participating in this year's summit. I hope that you have an enlightening and memorable experience at Norwich. Right now, I would like to introduce the chair of the first roundtable discussion, Dr. Esther Senis. Dr. Senis is Mary Curry Actions Research Fellow in the Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology at the Central European University in Vienna, Austria. She is currently hosted by the Peace and War Center as a visiting scholar and is a senior fellow at the Center for Global Resilience and Security at Norwich University. She holds PhD in Systemic Functional Linguistics from the University of Sydney. Now I turn it over to Dr. Senis.
Let's
give a round of applause.
Thank you, Dr. Koo, and good morning, everybody. It is my honor and privilege to moderate the first panel discussion today that concerns Russia's domestic politics and foreign policy. Yesterday, we attended excellent presentations on very timely topics concerning Russia's invasion of Ukraine, its previous invasions of Georgia and Syria, Russia's response to Western sanctions, its growing alliance with China, and its information warfare and disinformation campaigns. Today, in this roundtable discussion, we'll have more time to dive into these issues in more detail. So before we start, just some housekeeping notes. I will first introduce our distinguished panelists, and then we'll have about 30 minutes to discuss some follow-up questions on yesterday's presentations. Since we have lots of students, and especially high school students attending, welcome, I will provide the context for each question very briefly. And after this 30-minute discussion, we'll open the floor for question and answers. So please allow me to introduce our panelists. Starting from the far end of the table, Peter Rutland is a professor of government at Wesleyan University and vice president of the Association for Study of Nationalities. He works on nationalism and political economy in the post-Soviet space. His recent articles include Understanding Putin's Russia in Perspectives on Politics, 2021, and Nation Building in the Baltic States, 30 Years of Independence in the Journal of Baltic Studies, 2021. Professor Angela Katrievsky is Associate Professor of Political Science at Arcadia University in suburban Philadelphia. She specializes in conflict resolution, security studies, minority rights, and divided societies, with a particular focus on conflicts involving Russian-speaking minorities in Ukraine, the Baltic States, and Moldova. She was a Fulbright Scholar in Ukraine in spring 2018, teaching at Karazin National University, and began field research in Kharkiv and Odessa. She is currently working on a book on shifting identity borders among Russian-speaking Ukrainians based upon extensive fieldwork conducted in 2019 and 2020. Our next panelist, Professor Vitaly Kosrev, is an expert in comparative politics, strategic studies, and foreign policy in Eurasia. His major interest is great power politics, East-West relations, international conflict, and the political economy of regionalism and regional integration. From 2014 to 2019, he was an Asia Studies Fellow at the East-West Center, Washington, and a Senior Fellow at National University of Singapore, and served as a Senior Fellow at the Davis Center of Russian and Eurasian Studies, Harvard University. He was a visiting professor at the European Studies Council at Yale University's Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies. At present, he is Professor of Political Science and International Studies at Endicott College in Beverly, Massachusetts. He is also affiliated with the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard University as Associate in Research. Professor Thomas Graham, sitting next to me, is a Distinguished Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He is also currently a Senior Advisor at the Kissinger Associates, where he focuses on Russian and Eurasian affairs. He is co-founder of Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies program at Yale University and sits on its faculty steering committee. He is also a research fellow at the Macmillan Center at Yale, where he teaches a course on US-Russian relations. Graham was Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Russia on the National Security Council staff from 2004 to 2007, during which he managed a White House Kremlin strategic dialogue. He was Director for Russian Affairs on the staff from 2002 and 2004. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists. Thank you all for being here. So our first question today, I'm going to address this to everybody in the panel, concerns, of course, the war in Ukraine. So after threatening to invade Ukraine for the past several months, Russia did eventually invade. We've now seen horrific images of the war, bombing and shelling of civilian targets, residential buildings, schools, hospitals, and maternity wards, theaters, cities reduced to rubble, and a nuclear power plant on fire. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees said last Sunday that approximately 10 million people have been displaced so far, including the 3.5 million refugees who have fled Ukraine already. So after a series of failed diplomatic meetings and negotiations between the Kremlin, Ukraine, and the West, violations of ceasefire, escalating tension, and threats, where do things stand at the moment, and how long do you think this war will last?
Where do you want to start? I'll take a stab at that, and then my co-panelists can correct my mistakes and add. And I think first it's clear that this conflict has lasted much longer than President Putin expected it would. He miscalculated the strength of the Ukrainian resistance, he miscalculated the unity of the West in levying sanctions, and he miscalculated the strength of his own military. He thought he would be in Kiev in 1 to 2, maybe maximum 3 or 4 days. This conflict would largely be over. We're now entering the 5th week of the conflict. Russia has changed its tactics. It is clearly aimed at terrorizing the civilian population at this point. We've seen the horrific pictures of the destruction of cities, countryside in Ukraine over the past several weeks. It's very difficult, I think, at this point to judge how long this conflict might last. Putin is certainly in no mood to back down at this point. It's not only, from his standpoint, the future of Russia that is at stake, but probably more important is the future of President Putin himself that is at stake in this conflict. And it's very difficult for him to accept anything that he can't sell as a win to the Russian population. By the same token, it's quite clear that the Ukrainians are determined to defend their sovereignty, their independence, their freedoms, and they are receiving sufficient provisions from the West in order to continue this resistance for many, many weeks. So we're far from a point, I think, where we've reached a military stalemate that would lead both sides in the conflict to the conclusion that it's time to sit down and try to negotiate a settlement to this conflict. So I expect that we're going to see this conflict continue for weeks and months, and possibly even longer than that.
Thank you, Professor Graham. Yeah, Professor Rutland?
Yeah, it's an interesting question to ask. When did this war begin? Because it did not begin on 24th of February, 2022. It began on 22nd of February, 2014, when Russia sent troops to occupy Crimea. And it's only in retrospect that we see now that the war began then, and the war has been fought continually since then in the Donbass with shelling and sniping that's killed around 15,000 people. And it's the same in a historical context. If you ask, when did World War II start? Right? For Americans, it was December the 7th, 1941. For Russians, it was 22nd of June, 1941. For most of Europe, it was September 1939. For China, it was 1937, or maybe 1931, when Japan occupied Manchuria, a province of China. So this war has already been going on, basically, for 8 years. And it's likely to continue, I would say, for another 7 or 8 years, because Putin's not going to give up. He's going to partition Ukraine. The Ukrainians won't accept the partition, and it will drag on for years, I'm afraid. That's a gloomy prognosis, but as a way of getting the conversation going, that's what I'm putting on the table.
Thank you, Professor Rutland. Who would like to jump in? Angela?
So we go in order. I guess I would tackle sort of the two pieces of the question. The first piece being sort of about NATO and what kind of motivated this war to start to begin with. I agree completely that nothing would make Putin happier than to cause the collapse of American leadership in Europe by weakening or completely destroying the credibility of the NATO alliance and dividing the European Union and sort of eliminating American leadership in Europe. But I don't really think that that's what started this current phase of the war, which I agree started in 2014 and has been ongoing since. And the Ukrainians have repeatedly said that, hey guys, we've been at war already 8 years, so don't forget about that. I think if we think about what is often cited, particularly in the West, that really if we could just get Ukraine to agree that they're not going into NATO and we could just get Ukraine to accept some sort of neutral status, none of this would happen. And I just don't think we've got evidence of that, right? I mean, there's no evidence that Ukraine was on any kind of an even medium-term track to get into NATO. They had been sort of promised in 2008 that the door wasn't closed, and then given a whole laundry list of things that they had to do, and the goalposts keep changing. And meanwhile, small countries without the modern army that Ukraine was told was a prerequisite, such as, Montenegro or Macedonia, are admitted to the alliance. So I don't think anyone really thought that it was realistic that Ukraine was going to be in NATO anytime soon. And if what Putin wanted was a neutral Ukraine or a Ukraine outside of NATO, he could have sent troops into Donbass and that would have achieved both of those aims and it would have been over. That's not what he did. He launched an incredibly broad-scale, massive, brutal invasion of the entire country. And you can't explain NATO or neutrality, I think. NATO or neutrality doesn't explain the kind of massive onslaught. And I think it's also important to keep in mind that the cities that Putin is targeting ruthlessly and shelling into rubble are Russian-speaking cities. And one has to wonder if this might not be some sort of punishment for Kharkiv, a Russian-speaking city 25 miles from the border, for daring to be determined to protect their Ukrainianness, right? For not falling along in line that, hey, this is the Russian Spring, we're here to liberate you. They say, no, thank you, we don't want to be liberated. And I think he's incredibly furious that there is such resistance in these Russian-speaking cities. So the ones being reduced to rubble are Russian-speaking, and I think that's important to note. So
that's a very important point to make. Thank you, Professor Katrievsky. Professor Kosrev?
All right, my take on this is that Putin, since his first years as president, had a dream, the dream of being part of the overall, as Gorbachev used to say, the European house, the common European house. So he expressed many times when he became president that, yes, we have the bad West and the good West. The bad West is the United States and the good West is Europe. So we would like to actually be a kind of Eurocentric exercise, some Eurocentric policies to get integrated with Europe. But his idea was to get integrated with Europe as the already kind of Eurasian Union. And Eurasian Union is because of the economy of scale and because of competitiveness. He believed that because of the previous economic ties between Russia and the other post-Soviet republics, he believed that it could have been a kind of integration process, but obviously with Russia, with Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, like as the major economies within this Eurasian Union. But he failed to actually understand that Ukraine was actually, Belarus as well, were building their own identity. And if we remember, I recall actually President Kuchma's 2003 book, Ukraine is Not Russia. It was like a long time ago. So I would say that war started a long time ago with this identity crisis and with the lack of misunderstanding between the Ukrainian people and including elite and including the people, the ordinary people, and the Russians. For just one simple reason, just Russia couldn't bring up any good model of governance, effective governance, and modernization. Should Russia have established some sort of like good example for other post-Soviet states, everybody would gravitate to Russia. But Russia, on the contrary, had established authoritarian regime with oligarchic actually economy. As some of my colleagues say in Russia, the new enforcement elites, Putin's friends, privatized the state, and they looked at the national interest from the perspective of their own group interest. So that actually how they actually try to court Ukraine, by establishing ties with oligarchs, by paying, involving them into different economic projects, which actually never brought any good results in terms of economic livelihood and economic effectiveness for the ordinary people in Ukraine. So Ukrainians actually didn't see Russia as a potential partner in this integration. Therefore, they just started calling, especially younger generation, calling for an alliance with Europe, obviously because European Union was a good example, is empire by example, and the European Union could have brought like huge, like boost and results in terms of economic modernization of Ukraine. So I think that the reason was based the cause of this war and the kind of the long-term actually tensions between Ukraine and Russia could explain the outburst of this current conflict. And second part of this is the attitudes toward NATO. For the West, the NATO enlargement was seen as the establishment of the democratic liberal regimes. So it was like the spread of democratic institutions. So you could become a member of the NATO if you modernize your political institutions and political system. And for the West, for many, many years, until the 2014, NATO expansion, enlargement was seen as, and for those countries who actually joined the NATO, as a part of the, kind of political modernization, a state-making, nation-making, right, process. For the Russians, actually, they tolerated this for a long time, but then they realized that the NATO enlargement was probably part of the American hegemonic mission. And so they started looking at NATO from the perspective of security dilemma. And then finally, when someone said here that it was not about the like the membership of, I think Angela said this about the membership, real membership of Ukraine in NATO, but as Putin and his planners were saying that Ukraine had become in de facto a NATO ally, just when arming Ukraine and just training Ukraine. They've trained like 7,000 snipers, 25,000 specialists on especially in the city warfare, guerrilla warfare. So that's has become a matter of concern. So Putin decided that to attack now because he was afraid that in 5 years it will be no way for the Russian troops actually to intervene and to fight against Ukraine, because it will be much more stronger and could have been a much more modernized Ukraine.
Thank you, Professor Kosrev. So your points actually are a great segue to our next question that concerns Russia's domestic politics and looking at Putin at home and how the war impacts his popularity. So regarding the domestic political climate, while Putin attempts to undermine the democratic values and ideals of Western liberal democracies, at home in Russia he actively crushes them. In the past few years, new laws have systematically restricted basic human rights and freedoms. Repression of civil society, attacks on human rights activists, and assassinations of opposition politicians and journalists have been rampant. Alexei Navalny, the leader of the opposition, was poisoned by the regime and is currently in jail, and just this morning he was found guilty of large-scale fraud and could spend many more years in jail. In the last 3 weeks, we've also seen thousands of Russians protest against the war, risking arrest, and Putin's new fake news law could send people speaking out against the war to prison for up to 15 years. So the question is, how is the current war impacting Putin's popularity at home? And will he be able to prevent the spread of democratic and anti-authoritarian values and ideas in the long run? Professor Rutland, would you like to go first?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, well, I'm afraid liberals in Russia have always had a hard time, starting with the 1825 Decembrist rebellion. It's been kind of downhill all the way for liberals since then. So brave and heroic as is Alexei Navalny and his followers, supporters, and protesters, I'm afraid they're not going to be a source of change in Russia in the near term. What brings down authoritarian regimes, as Erica Chenoweth's work has shown, is defection of security elites. At some point, the military, the police have decided they don't want to shoot people on the street anymore. So the key question for me is, well, what's going on in the mind of the Russian security forces, which is very difficult to find out. However, there was an interesting development just a few weeks before the invasion. There were two articles that appeared, well, one petition and one article in the Russian press from Mikhail Khodorkovsky on February the 3rd and from Leonid Ivashko on January the 31st. And they are both senior officials, formerly in the general staff, retired, one a general, one a colonel, retired, both of them, well known as being far-right nationalists. And they both published items in the Russian press saying the forthcoming war with Ukraine is a disaster. It's a really, really bad idea. We're going to lose. You don't understand the Ukrainians. This will be terrible for the Russian army. Don't do it. I wrote an article about that called Breaking Ranks on February the 14th. And we don't know, is that the tip of an iceberg or is that just an ice cube? We don't know how common are those views in the Russian military, but I think Putin, if anything's going to stop this war, it's going to be basically a kind of mutiny in the upper ranks of the Russian military. So Putin has nothing to fear from the liberals, I'm afraid. He has a lot to fear from the nationalist right, who we can see that this war is terrible for Russia itself. Even a Russian nationalist can see that. And so that's my contribution to this question.
Thank you, Professor Rutland. Who would like to go first? Go next.
Yeah, my belief is that it's the clash of civilizations. So because for those who actually established the new Putin's vertical, including Putin himself, the events in Russia in the 90s were associated with the so-called barbarization of the state. And barbarization of the state was actually being associated with the spread of liberal democracy. So they believed that liberal democracy and how it was implemented in Russia was absolutely devastating for Russia, because Russia lost within a decade 40% of its previous GDP from starting 1991 until 2000. And they believed that was a disaster and it was a chaos, Wild West. Liberalization didn't work. It enriched only certain Western-oriented elites. And with the help of different actually advisors from the West. So I thought that probably Putin's revolt was an attempt by the former enforcement actually groups related with the ex-KGB who considered themselves as nationalistic to kind of revive the national spirit of Russia. So they started establishing a very top-down regime based on authoritarianism. And these processes, yesterday we mentioned this, associated with the so-called perception of the cultural security in China. So, and by the way, both China and Russia have adopted some laws and regulations about cultural security as part of their national security. What is cultural security? Is the attempt by the Western forces, by the Western powers, to actually get down to this Russian society or Chinese society. And no wonder Hillary Clinton developed the perception of the 21st century statecraft. It was her baby, the economic statecraft and 21st century statecraft, which was diplomacy for the United States during actually the Obama administration times, was considered to be a part of the reach out through social media and other means of communication, reach out to hearts and minds of the population in different countries, avoiding governance. So there was a kind of revolution in diplomacy. And for Russia and China, it was unacceptable. They believed that was a kind of attempt to obtain support of the United States and the West and Western values, just avoiding just traditional diplomacy channels and reaching out to the people and actually stirring those color revolutions, so which actually they also considered, both China and Russia considered as part of the actually democratic offensive by the West. So as a result, we had the rise of, we have seen the rise of authoritarianism, toughening of the rules and regulations in both China and Russia. They learn from each other. Even the title of the laws and regulations they adopt are similar, right? And finally, they have actually even started to promote the idea of alternative democracy. And in the recent actually joint statement on February 4th, the statement starts with the idea that Russia and China are the advocates of real democracy, just not liberal democracy, which actually enriches only the oligarchs in the West, but this real democracy, which in China, for example, they associate with the role of the state, and in Russia they associate with the role of the indispensable leader, right? And finally, Sergei Karaganov, who is is known as the very close advisor to the Kremlin, actually published a few years ago an interesting article about the victorious march of authoritarianisms in the world, especially in the context of the many multiple publications in the West about the crisis of legitimacy in the West, especially when Donald Trump came to power. So everybody expected that in the world, and especially in Russia and China, that is the case, that Donald Trump represents this very trend of the actually advent of authoritarianisms in the world. So because in the era of globalization, you cannot compete just by being liberal democracy, because it's the process of decision making too slow, the society is too open, economies are too open. So in order to save your national identity and national sovereignty, it's all about sovereignty. It's all about the challenges of post-sovereign world. You have to actually become more authoritarian. No wonder they just said, oh, Trump, this is so good. You see, that represents even America is becoming authoritarian. So I would recommend you to go to find this Karaganov's article and look at how he tries to justify the worldwide spread of authoritarianism. He said that, yeah, some countries might be, depending on their cultural background, authoritarian democracies. Some countries might become democratic authoritarianism. So probably Russia, in our case, is like democratic authoritarianism. So I think that's the point and the reason why actually the Putin's regime, as well as Xi's administration, have really tightened their grip on human rights, democracy, and the freedom of press, and freedom of assembly, and other basic political rights which we have here in the West.
Professor Kosrev, thank you. Professor Kaczyjewski, since you research identity, I would be really interested in hearing your opinion on this.
I'd first like to kind of circle back to the question about NATO, but I promise to be super quick. And
I think a lot of people talk about the special partnership between Russia and NATO and how that hasn't really worked out, and we've got this NATO-Russia Council, and it never seems to work in terms of trying to integrate Russia. But often we forget that NATO also has a special treaty and a special sort of relationship with Ukraine. It's not just this country out there that we're going to cooperate with. They have a very strong partnership. And for Ukraine, that's never been considered de facto membership for NATO, but I can totally see why it would be by the Russians. So I just want to say thank you for that perspective. For Ukraine, if you don't have full membership, you don't have Article 5, this other stuff is not that important, but I can see why the Russians would see that differently. I think, Peter's point about the military, I think, is spot on, because the liberals have never had that much influence in Russia outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg. In terms of popular mass kind of potential for mobilization. And one can only imagine that any kind of threat to Putin's regime is going to have to come from the military. And it's one thing to talk about, we're a great power, we're restoring our great power status, this is great, how wonderful is Russia? That can keep the military happy, but they can't at all possibly be happy with how things are going in Ukraine. So I agree that this war in Ukraine is going to go on for a long time. The Ukrainians know very well that the alternative to fighting is to live under Putin's type of regime, that you will have authoritarianism, you will have the intellectuals locked up, you will have no human rights. They know this very well, and they're not going to give up, and there are 43 million of them. So I think until Russia is defeated and expelled, or all of the Ukrainians are killed, this war is going to go on, unfortunately, and that cannot bode well for morale in the Russian military. So I would think, to my mind, that would probably, yes, be the best source. Identity, I don't know, what else could I say about identity in Russia? I'm sorry, I was focusing on the other thing. Did I address everything, or Esther?
I suppose so, yeah.
Oh, the end of democracy in Russia. When did we have democracy in Russia? I think that there was a little experiment, in the early 90s. And I say this with a lot of pain in my heart, and this is something that Mary and I have talked about. We worked as just fresh out of college on democratization projects in Russia, where we really had such incredible high hopes for the future of democracy and the ability of Russia to sort of integrate with the rest of the world. And, the end of the Soviet Union was driven by a lot of factors, but one big, huge factor was a democratic revolution type movement in Russia, that Boris Yeltsin stood up and got millions of people to come together and get out on the street. And you can argue whether or not he actually was a real Democrat, and in the end he didn't turn out to be one. But there was a lot of hope in the early 90s. There was a free press. People could make fun of the president on TV with comedy shows, these kind of dolls going around making everyone look silly. And, but that was a short-lived, unfortunately, experiment. And even already in 1993, there was a lot of pressure to lower the power of the Western-leaning liberals, because the economic policies were a disaster, and there was a perception of Russian national interests not really being respected. So for me, it's sad to say, but I've only seen things go downhill since 1992. Sorry, I can't be more positive.
Can I?
Thank you, Professor Kaczujewski. Yeah, Professor Graham.
Just to pick up on a couple of points that have been made. I agree with Peter that it's the military that probably poses the greatest threat to Putin, or the group that would undermine him in his current position. The liberals, as has been noted, have been fairly ineffectual throughout Russian history, and certainly since the breakup of the Soviet Union. But that sort of begs the question as to why the Kremlin has cracked down so hard on Navalny's organization, other dissident movements in Russia. Clearly they're afraid of something, and so I think we need to ask the question, what in particular? Now there are a couple of answers to this, I think. First, I think Russia, the Kremlin, Putin himself, have looked at the color revolutions. These were also directed against, in many cases, authoritarian regimes, where you would have thought the security forces would have played the lead role in undermining a political leader or not. and yet it was the street that did it, and a fairly small element of the population that in effect produced the change in regime in Georgia, Ukraine twice, in 2004 and 2014 in Kyrgyzstan. And I know from my personal experience that the Russians were quite concerned about the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004. And I had a conversation with a fairly senior Kremlin official at that point, responsible for domestic politics, and he was organizing youth groups at that point. Why was he organizing youth groups at that point? Because, as he told me, because we're not going to lose the battle in the streets. If you try to do a color revolution in Russia, we are going to have the muscle to put on the streets to beat that back. That's the second reason they're concerned, because they don't believe it's an indigenous movement. They believe that the dissident movement in Russia, the movement led by Navalny, is actually something that is funded by the United States, it's pushed by the United States, and it's part of a larger U.S. effort to undermine the Russian regime. This is what they call hybrid warfare, right? Looking at the color revolutions and seeing this as a tool of American foreign policy. So this is not about dissent inside Russia. This is about the United States instigating dissent in Russia as a way of effectuating regime change at some point. So that, I think, is one reason why we see this concern about what is a fairly small slice of Russian society. Let me make one final point about democracy. I would actually argue that Russia was most democratic in the very late Soviet period. The freest and fairest elections in Russia, in my mind, occurred in 1989 and 1990 under the during the Soviet period, where there were many different points of view that were expressed. The votes were actually counted properly throughout the country, and they led to some very surprising results, results that ultimately brought down the Soviet Union, one could argue. Every election that occurred in post-Soviet Russia has been less free and fair than the elections in 1990 inside Russia, and again for various reasons. The so-called Democrats were more than happy to violate all the rules of an open and free fair election in 1996 to ensure that President Yeltsin was reelected and that a Communist Party leader did not gain power at that point. And he did that with the backing of the United States. The other problem for democracy in Russia is something that Angela alluded to, and that is that the period that we consider to be most free and fair in Russia also coincided with the deepest socioeconomic crisis that Russia has faced in many, many decades. And so while you had a very liberal part of society, Moscow and St. Petersburg, that were advocating freedom, were actually living much better, much of the rest of the country was sinking into poverty. The ruble became worthless. They had very great difficulty getting education, healthcare, and so forth. And that quite naturally turned much of the population against a Western view of democracy. And that is something that Putin has played on since 2000, or since he rose to power at the very end of 1999. So part of the challenge for people who want to introduce democracy into Russia is breaking that connection between democratic rule and socioeconomic crisis, to overcome the 1990s, to present a different narrative to the Russian population. And we haven't seen anybody that's capable of doing that up to this point.
Can I just add one quick,
Of course.
really quick note? When I was working straight out of college in the early 1990s in Russia, what I was working on were student exchanges, right? So these were programs that were funded through the State Department to bring young Russians, all over the former Soviet space, but I was working out of Moscow, to come live in an American family and study in an American school for a year. And I worked on these programs. Years ago, Putin decided to end Russian participation in these programs. So we no longer have Russian students coming and living in American families. So there were generations of young Russians who had their own experience of what the United States was like because they'd gone to high school or they'd gone to college and they lived in a family. And that proved to be a bit too dangerous, I think, for some of the reasons that Tom was pointing to. So I just wanted to say we still have them in Georgia, we still have them in Ukraine, but Russian students no longer participate.
Thank you for making that point. Actually, that's really important, especially because it kind of segues into my next question. So we've talked about authoritarianism in Russia at home, and now I want to move on to talking about exporting authoritarianism. And you mentioned how Russian students were coming into the United States, but that was the same situation with Central European University that was founded in 1990 after the wall came down, and they were based in Budapest, Hungary for almost 30 years until the Hungarian government forced them to relocate to Vienna. For exactly one of the reasons were that too many students who graduated from Central European University were returning to Russia and the post-Soviet sphere and making trouble, being too liberal, etc., etc. So that's a very important point. So this question concerns the Kremlin strengthening its ties with especially far-right European parties through political visits, financial support, state media support to overcome its isolation after the annexation of the Crimea in 2014 and to enhance its legitimacy. So Russia's anti-European Union, anti-NATO, and anti-Western rhetoric converges with the European far-right's Euroscepticism and its rhetoric that opposes democratic European values. In Central and Eastern Europe especially, Russia has been successful in inflating its authoritarian superpower image, creating what Peter Krakow, the director of the Independent Research Center Political Capital, calls an exaggerated view of Russia's economic and military power. So the question is basically, how is the war in Ukraine expected to shape or reshape the stability of Ukraine and the regions of Eastern and Central Europe where there has already been an authoritarian turn? And what would the long-term implications be for Western democracies? Professor Kaczyjewski, I would like you to respond first.
There's a lot there, so I'll just tackle one tiny bit, which I think I think that the war in Ukraine, and of course it is my area of study, so I'm open to maybe this isn't true, but it seems to me that the war in Ukraine is going to have a massive impact and change on all of that, right? So if anybody is pitting up sort of the soft power of Russia and, hey, look how great we are, be more like us, versus what we've seen from the Ukrainian people, which is frankly, even for people who love Ukraine, rather remarkable to watch. I think it's going to be very difficult to say, we don't want to follow the democratic model after what we've seen unfolding in Ukraine.
Thank you. Please, Professor Rutland?
Yeah, well, something about me and that microphone.
You've got another microphone.
So the answer to that question I heard on the radio driving up this morning. There was a report on the French presidential election campaign.
Maybe the other one. You just turned one on.
Turn that one on.
This one, I'll try this.
Try that one.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, so the French presidential election campaign, and the reporter was explaining that Eric Zemmour, who was a far-right candidate, who was kind of threatening to take the far-right position away from Marine Le Pen, his campaign has collapsed because for the past few months he's been praising Putin as a strong leader, and the whole election campaign in France has been transformed because Macron is now sure of re-election because he's the wartime president standing up against Putin. So that's one very specific example of how this strategy of Putin's of trying to bolster the far right in Europe has just disintegrated. And it's going to be very difficult. Poland as well is very strongly supportive of Ukraine, although Poland was one of the bad boys of drifting into authoritarianism. And so Putin's strategy in Europe has totally failed now. And who are his friends in the world? What are the countries that voted for Russia at the UN General Assembly? It's Syria, North Korea, Eritrea. Well, good luck with those folks as political and economic partners in the future.
Quick thing. I agree with this idea that it has collapsed in Europe, but I think it's also collapsed in the United States because it's becoming increasingly difficult to say anything positive about Putin these days here.
Let me add just a counterpoint to that. We focused on Russia's support for authoritarian populist elements in Europe and in the United States, and that's indeed part of it. But Russia was an equal opportunity supplier for anybody who was a dissident voice in the Western world. On the left as well as on the right. We tend to focus on the right because of what we see happening in Russia. But the goal was to disrupt European political systems. And if some force on the left was capable of doing that, Moscow was more than happy to support a left-wing force. If you thought that you wanted to maintain Germany as an energy partner, then quite frankly, you could support Greens. Close down the nuclear reactors. That makes Germany much more dependent on Russian oil and gas. So the goal for Russia is to destabilize European countries, to destabilize the United States. There are forces across the political spectrum that can do that. So we shouldn't focus simply on the authoritarian element of this.
Yeah, I would agree with the. Here comes my turn. I agree with the statement that, with this assumption that yes, the outcome of this is being the absolutely unprecedented consolidation of Europe, the European. So I have some doubts about the previously pronounced thesis about the Putin's ultimate goal is to weaken the West. I think that as a result of this crisis, the West has become much more consolidated. Some people even joke, saying that the Nato has to probably erect one monument for Putin in front of this, in Brussels, in front of the headquarters, because he really just made just this situation has really shifted the attitudes in both Europe and the United States, as the West is, as the Russians are saying, collective West has become absolutely much more consolidated, and all attempts now to talk about like interest-based negotiations to kind of compromise or cooperate in terms of on some sort of shared interest, like being kind of ostracized by the West, because the West cannot now talk with Russia based on purely interest. The West has to talk, and it's being driven very much by values. So that's all like American foreign policy. We'll talk about American foreign policy strategy in about an hour, and this is all about interests or values, right? So we have the absolutely kind of like we used to have some sort of equilibrium in terms of interests and values, and now we have absolutely prevailed interest-driven strategies in the West versus the values-based strategies in the West versus interest-based strategies in Russia and China, by the way. So that is the point, and I think that the Ukraine might end up being fragmented, which is probably would be a sad outcome of this, because it will be very hard to control and secure some sort of identity change in the whole Ukraine.
Can I actually make a contrary point to that? I think there's a real danger to extrapolating from the past 4 weeks and think that everything's over. Yes, I mean, the West has demonstrated unity that we hadn't expected, but the fundamental problems that led to disunity in the West haven't disappeared. The fundamental problems that polarize American society and American politics haven't disappeared, even if there you see Republicans and Democrats in Washington rallying around support for Ukraine at this point. Take a look at the hearings that are now underway for the next Supreme Court justice and ask yourself whether that is evidence that Americans realize that they need to come together in order to deal with this threat to freedom and democracy around the world. Same thing in Europe. There are a host of problems that remain unresolved. As this conflict continues, as the strains and stresses on European society that come from refugees, that come from inflation, that come from supply chains, to the extent that the sacrifice is not distributed evenly across Europe, you're going to see cracks begin to break in European unity. So, yes, there's an opportunity now to unite the West, to overcome polarization in countries like the United States and European countries. That depends on political leadership. It depends on making sure that the sacrifice that we will endure in order to support Ukraine is seen to be distributed equitably across society and among countries in Europe. So we have an opportunity to change the trajectory, but the trajectory hasn't changed at this point. I think that's something important that we need to keep in mind. How we will think about this event a year from now could be radically different from the way we think about it today.
Thank you, Professor Graham. I could ask another 10 questions, and we could sit here for another week discussing these topics. So I think I'm going to turn it over to the audience now. So thank you all very much for your very insightful and informative comments. I'm sure we have all learned a lot. So I would like to invite the audience and encourage especially our students to ask questions. Please line up at the microphones on two sides of the auditorium, and please introduce yourselves and then ask your question. So we have about 25 minutes left.
Is this on? Okay. My name is Cadet Corporal Walker, and I had a question for the entire panel. Could you speak to the effects of the Budapest Memorandum has had on the current state of Ukraine and just a relationship for the years prior?
I'll give a stab at that. If anyone doesn't know, the Budapest Memorandum was, it's my turn, I guess. Budapest Memorandum was a security guarantee signed by the United States, the UK, I don't remember if Germany signed it, and Russia, basically guaranteeing Ukrainian territorial integrity and sovereignty in exchange for them giving up the nuclear weapons that were on their soil, right? So if the Soviet Union falls apart, some countries that are newly independent had Soviet nuclear arsenal. I think it's had a big impact on Ukraine, to the extent that actually they were talking about it today, saying, if we had Article 5, guarantee with NATO, this never would have happened. And I don't know if that's true or not, but certainly within Ukraine, the failure of the signatories to guarantee their sovereignty and their territorial integrity based upon a signature on a piece of paper has made it less likely that they will accept those kinds of guarantees in the future.
Thank you.
I just add a point to that. The Budapest Memorandum actually didn't provide security guarantees. It provided security assurances.
Assurances, thank you.
Which was the term, and there's a difference. Basically, the three powers that signed it, UK, United States, and Russia, said that they would respect Ukrainian sovereignty. They would respect Ukrainian territorial integrity. They would not use the threat or use of force in dealing with Ukraine. But there was nothing in the Budapest Memorandum that required any three of those major powers to do anything if Ukraine's security and independence came under threat. So where that has led us is that the Ukrainians want a firmer sort of commitment, real security guarantees, so that if their independence is threatened in the future, the United States or a NATO country would be obliged to undertake activities to defend Ukraine, not the current situation that they had before the recent conflict.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take a question from this side. Thank you.
Is this on? It is. Okay. I'm tall, so I'm going to squat down. My name's Cadet First Sergeant Smith. My question stems from the discussion of a possible regime change in Russia. A lot of authoritarian leaders utilize fear to try to manipulate their citizens to follow whatever they want. And I feel that what Putin's doing right now is a form of fear, and the discussion earlier of nationalists being his number one problem. If he uses so much fear, do you think that there's a possibility that even the nationalists will succumb to what he wants, continuing with his regime and not seeing a change in the near future?
Who would like to touch on this?
Yes, I think the Putin regime is very durable. So I'm not really betting any money on regime change in the immediate future. So I was just kind of speculating of one scenario of a revolt from the right that could bring him down. But I think it's basically a stable regime, and the invasion of Ukraine is destabilizing it, because things are happening on the ground in the war, which is a change factor from outside, which may result in change. But I'm not very optimistic that because the fear and the control does work, and we'll talk later on, I think, about disinformation and social media, and that is that a game changer or not. But I'm not very optimistic. So I think we're stuck with this regime for some time, and also doubling down on the pessimism, the structures in place. I think we can imagine that the successor to Putin is not going to be that different from Putin. It's not like he or she is going to reinvent the system. It would be great if that happens, but I think it's a structural problem. It's not just that Putin is crazy or he's getting old or whatever. It's structures of power that have been built up for the past 25 years, and we're seeing the consequences of that regime in action.
Richard Haley published an article about the service class revolution and the tradition in Russia, explaining that every time there's a kind of the establishment of authoritarian regime, starting from Ivan the Terrible, right, until today, has been actually the outcome, the result of this so-called foreign threat perception-based service class revolution. So I believe I would agree with Professor Rutland that the regime is durable, and it's not only fear. Fear is Turkmenistan, right? So when you cannot just like wear any like other colors rather than white or green, or build a house in other colors rather than white, right? So this is fear, right? But in Russia, it's not fear. Especially young generation, they kind of very, I would say fluid, and I think it's not only fear. It's propaganda. It's the establishment of the atmosphere of the kind of fortress Russia. Encirclement by the aggressive, agonizing West, and that's why actually kind of mobilization type of I would compare this with post-totalitarian Soviet Union, like just with some elements of mobilization. So it's less fear, more mobilization, more propaganda, indoctrination of like different patriotic and nationalistic ideology. And also some ideas of no wonder monarchists are so popular now, like Putin is a new Tsar. So that actually explains a lot of things, and probably he himself, I heard, opposes this. He doesn't like the idea of being crowned, but probably it might happen in the near future.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
Hi, Officer Cadet Bonani Soprana from RNC Saint-Jean. I do have a question about a subject that we didn't really talk about since the 2 days. So we didn't really talk about refugees and immigration during like a conflict, and especially a war, and I think that's something we can really talk about right now since it is important. So knowing the situation that happened with Syrian refugees in since 2011, how can we say the international community is actually ready for another refugee crisis in regards of Ukraine and Russian conflicts right now?
The short answer to that question is that we're probably not all that prepared. I think you need to remember that the Syrian refugee crisis is somewhat different from the Ukrainian crisis at this point, in part because the Syrians, it was Middle Eastern, somewhat, if I can put it this way, alien to the dominant culture in Europe at this point. The Ukrainians are Europeans to some extent, and so they're more readily accepted in Europe than Syrian refugees would have been. We've seen a lot of the refugees flow into Poland, in part because there was a significant Ukrainian diaspora in Poland before the conflict, and there's a certain affinity between Poles and Ukrainians at this point. Not necessarily historically, but at this point there has been. I think the real issue here is the dimensions of it. We already have about 3.5 million Ukrainians who have fled Ukraine. I think the UN has just said that there are 10 million people who have been displaced by that. So that includes 6.5 million inside of Ukraine itself. As this conflict continues, you're going to see more and more people move westward. And the question is whether countries like Poland, like Romania, like Moldova, Hungary, and Slovakia really have the infrastructure to absorb that number of Ukrainian refugees and still maintain the type of political, social, economic stability that they need. So this was getting at something that I was referring to before. If we're going to maintain Western unity, then dealing with the refugee crisis has to be seen as spread across the countries of Europe, that it has to be equitable. Everybody is sharing in and helping Ukrainians. The United States has a role to play. At this point, Ukrainians are not accepted into the United States as refugees in the numbers that they would need to deal with this crisis, and that's an issue in American politics and legislation and so forth. So this is a major crisis. The numbers are numbers that we haven't seen in decades, and how the West is going to deal with this over the long run is going to be a real test of the unity of Western society and in our ability to be resilient in the face of these destructive types of activities that the Russians are creating in Ukraine.
Just let me highlight one aspect of this here is I've seen some publications saying that actually for Europe, which faces the demographic crisis and might really anticipate the influx of many refugees from the Middle East and North Africa, the invitation of those like maybe 10 million or 15 million of Ukrainians who are very hardworking people, smart, hardworking people, is not so bad. It's the Orthodox is a Christian population, and lots of people say that maybe it might be good for European Union. I mean, to get like more workforce rather than accepting more refugees from Yemen, for example, or North Africa, which is also part of the European policy and immigration policies, a Dublin Accord, but probably it might be also from the economic standpoint might be more beneficial for the European Union, unfortunately, out of this war. But I believe that Europe might be better prepared for like accepting refugees even than Russia. If Russia has to accept some refugees, it will be probably more problematic.
I wanted to add real quick, excuse me. I also think it's important to keep in mind that at this moment, the refugees are all women and children, because men of fighting age over age of 18 up to 60 are not allowed to leave the country. So we're really looking, I think, at a special kind of set of circumstances where it's much more compelling in the immediate sort of let's take in what I think most people at this point think is probably temporary, because they're leaving their husbands and sons behind, and they want to go home. So if the war should not go on forever, then I think that this would be more of a temporary situation. If we get to the point where it's entire families and you're thinking, do we have enough open jobs? How are we going to take care of these families for a longer kind of resettlement rather than temporary shelter? I think then that's when these bigger questions come up, because at this point it's not really for resettlement.
Professor Rutland?
Yeah, so following on from that, I think 75-80% of the 2015 refugees were men, typically young men, because it was very difficult to get all the way from Afghanistan to Syria. And there was the problem with Islamist terrorism. That was and is number one security challenge in Europe, and there's no terrorism factor in the Ukrainian refugees. It's just not an issue.
Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Cadet Faulkner, and with all the eyes on Putin right now, would you be able to discuss the impact of worldwide sanctions on his popularity and how he'll be able to keep this war effort going in Ukraine?
Yeah, these are unprecedented sanctions, and there are lots of talks now and debates within Russia about the mobilization economy and whether Russia has prepared itself for sanctions. My understanding is that Russia, since 2014, has been preparing for this war, and has made lots of measures to better prepare for the those really kind of sanctions from hell. There are some industries which really suffer. The banking, but the sanctions are not total. I mean, these sanctions that America has actually imposed in the West, even European Union has imposed even tougher sanctions than the United States in some industries and some areas. So I think that it might really hit hard the Russian economy, but there is a big question now whether the Russian establishment and the people society will be able to actually make this turn toward a kind of mobilization type of the economy. I'm very doubtful, because the population, people today, is not the people under the Stalinist, in the 1927 or the 1935, the huge, big, gigantic industrial, construction projects. It's very hard to mobilize people now. You have to have lots of investment and incentivize the young people to go. Some of the industries might work better. And the import substitution might be really accelerated. But for example, the Russians do not have any planes now to fly because they forgot how to make planes, except for the fighter jets. So maybe we'll travel across the country on the fighter jets. I remember when Iraq was sanctioned, my friends used to fly to speak with the Tariq Aziz, who was Prime Minister of Iraq, using the Su-29. So she said, okay, there is no way we have to fly this way. So I think that it's tough. It's a big question. It's a great question, by the way. It's like, what will happen? To what extent the government and the elite is ready and mobilized? Given the fact that we have the Russian, we have the medium level and low level elite is very not very competent. Lots of nepotism and the not very efficient governance system. So it's a very tough task. I'm not very optimistic about this, but they have to do something to. That's why to kind of modernize or remodernize Russia, and that's why we've spoken with Professor Goldstein yesterday about the cooperation with China. So probably the Russians hope that maybe Chinese could help them establish some production lines, and we have already some examples of successful, for example, production of machinery near Moscow. So with the help of Chinese, so Chinese had invested, they set up, they provide some technologies. That might be an option for Russia.
Can I add something?
Yes, go ahead.
One of the ironies of the sanctions that we've leveled is that the group that they've hit most hard in Russia at this point, it's not the oligarchs. The oligarchs will survive. After all, they have billions of dollars. It's not the vast majority of Russians who, quite frankly, don't live that well to begin with in any event. The group that's going to be hit hardest by this are urban, young professionals. People who work for Western companies who have lost their jobs, or will soon lose their jobs, people whose credit cards won't work outside of Russia any longer, and therefore, and because of travel restrictions, won't be able to take their vacations in Europe, won't be able to travel to the United States. People who won't be able to import goods from outside, in part because of the rising prices. Many Russians consider them luxury goods. We would consider them sort of everyday staples. A lot of electronic equipment, for example, beauty products, the cat food and dog food, for example. And the irony of this is that our sanctions are hitting hardest against that stratum in Russian society that is most inclined to be cooperative with the West, most Western in its orientation, and in fact the group that we would like to see expanded in Russia, because that would provide for, we think, a better future and better and more constructive relations between our countries. One of the consequences of this, and the response that you've gotten from the Kremlin, which is much more repressive and repression, is that thousands of these, I think that the figure I've seen is 250,000, have already left the country, the best and the brightest in Russia. And this is going to have a long-term impact on Russia's ability to build a competitive economy in the 21st century. So while I think we all understand the urge to do something in order to punish Putin for his acts of aggression, we have this collateral damage that we're doing that is actually going to lead to a Russia that is perhaps less disposed to work constructively with the United States and the West in the future once this conflict winds down, as all conflicts eventually do. I don't know what the answer to it is, but I hope that someone in Washington, someone in European capitals is thinking about how do we save this very important stratum of Russian society that is critical to Russia's future and is critical to improve relations between the West and Russia.
Add just a small point. Thanks, Professor Graham. It's a great point. I would like to quote Professor Vakru from the Davis Center at Harvard, who just she had an interview with the National Public Radio probably a couple of weeks ago, and she said, "Yes, we just need to exert pressure on Russia, but not too much." Because there is another danger here. It's like if you sanction too much, you alienate the middle class, which is not so huge. In China, middle class is 250 million, probably, right? In Russia, it's like how many? What's the size of middle class in Russia? 20 million, right? So you don't want to alienate the middle class, and you don't want to actually suppress too much because they might be the best condition for even toughening the regime, and then maybe we'll see the Mussolini regime in the near future. I mean, because of the overwhelmingly tough sanctions on Russia. So it should be it's a very tiny process. I hope that the West understands this.
Thank you. So I think we're running out of time, so we might have time for one or two final questions. Go ahead.
Good morning. I'm Cadet Jacob Brandoff. I was actually going to ask about sanctions as well. So with the rapid increase in energy prices following the breakout of the war in Ukraine, how long do you believe the West can last with these sanctions, and what are some of our options for alternatives for energy?
And can you provide brief answers to this question, please? Professor Rutland?
There's a big difference between the US and European position because the US is an energy exporter. So if the prices of oil and gas go up, US producers benefit. I mean, US consumers don't. The real crunch is in Europe, where they're extremely dependent on the Russian imports, and it's a question of money. Right? They're going to have to pay more for their energy. They're going to have to invest in alternative sources, and the German government is on this. Right? Before February the 24th, they were still equivocating, still closing down the nuclear stations, investing in renewables, but not enough to wean themselves off Russian oil and gas. And the German government has done a 180-degree turn, and that's a very efficient society government. When they have a program, they will execute it, and they're willing to pay the cost. As in the earlier conversation, over time, that political consensus may erode, but I think it also fits in with the general desire to tackle climate change and to get away from fossil fuels anyway, which as a global community, we have to do that within the next 10, 15 years anyway. So this Russian incident is a kind of wake-up call that the age of oil and gas is over.
Yeah, of course, the problem is that those are all long-term, medium-term types of programs. The price of gas is rising now. The price of gas will continue to rise as we deal with the consequences and spillover effects of this crisis. And I think you've asked a very good question, which is how long will we maintain Western unity in the face of rising gas prices, gasoline prices? Again, it comes to the question, the equitable distribution of sacrifice. Yes, the United States is better positioned to deal with this than Europe is at this point. We are a net exporter of oil and gas, but of course we're not producing as much as we could because of political concerns in the United States, right? So we're going to countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, we've talked to the Venezuelans, there's some thought that we'll cut a deal with the Iranians so they can bring gas onto the market, because we don't want to bring it onto the market because we don't want to produce more in the United States for domestic political reasons. So again, there are all sorts we've got a near-term challenge that we have to master if we're going to maintain unity, while we think about how we develop our medium and long-term positions so that we don't face this type of challenge from Russia again. Whether we'll be able to navigate this politically, I think, is one of the big questions of the next several months. And we'll have an answer to that, to some extent, in November of this year in the United States.
Thank you. So we'll take one final question. Please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Cadet Toka, and my question is, especially in the situation with Russia, to my knowledge, there's going to be an election in 2 years. The sanctions are really cracking down on, as you said, average Russian civilians, especially those with professional jobs. So, with all that being said, my question was, what was Putin's objective in Ukraine to risk so much for effectively what is, in my opinion, digging just a further hole down in Russia? What did he want there that he was willing to sacrifice pretty much everything from Russian soldiers to the Russian economy itself?
So can you please try to give a 30-second response to this final question?
Yeah, I think he saw a window of opportunity and a danger coming, which is that Ukraine was rearming with drones, with anti-tank missiles, and Putin was afraid Ukraine would use those weapons to try and retake the Donbass. And in November last year, Ukraine did use one of the Turkish drones to destroy a howitzer in Donbass. So I think Putin was thinking, if we wait another 6 months, Ukraine will be much stronger militarily, and they will try to recapture those secessionist territories in the Donbass. So I think that was the time frame. It was a military, technology-driven decision. But I agree it's been a disastrous decision.
Professor Graham?
Putin didn't think he was running great risks. That's part of the problem. He thought this would be over by now. If he had taken Kiev in 5 days, if the Ukrainians had displaced the government, if Ukraine had surrendered, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. He miscalculated. So he didn't understand the risk that he was running. That's why he ran the risk that he did.
Thank you very much. So this concludes our first roundtable discussion this morning. Thank you all for being here in person, and also to those of you who have been following us online. Please join me in thanking our experts for their invaluable insights and for taking the time to travel here.
Thank you again. We have last summit roundtable discussions in 10 minutes. So starting at 10:50, so we will have second discussion panel here. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
come on in and have a seat. What a good-looking crowd this morning. Happy spring in Vermont for folks who are out of state. Welcome to Norwich University. I am Dr. Rolly Brucken, Professor of History at Norwich. My specialty is the history of international human rights law and U.S. foreign policy. I've taught classes relevant to this panel on the Cold War, human rights in Eastern Europe, and genocide. Having served as Amnesty International USA's country specialist on Zimbabwe for 18 years, I'm well acquainted with investigating human rights abuses, including war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Before I introduce the panel, I humbly ask us to take a moment of silence right now in memory of the victims, each of whom are individuals with parents, partners, children, friends, and who have aspirations, dreams, talents, and a desire to live in peace, as all of us do in this room. Thank you very much. I want to thank the staff of Norwich University's John and Mary Frances Patton's Peace and War Center, including Director Dr. Travis Morris and Associate Director Dr. Yang Mo Koo. I also want to thank today's panelists and you, the audience, for your time and commitment to self-education and public discussion of critical issues of international importance. It's an honor to moderate a distinguished panel. Let me introduce the folks on the panel. Lyle Goldstein is Director of Asia Engagement at Defense Priorities. Previously, he served as a research professor at the U.S. Naval War College for 20 years. His expertise includes maritime security and nuclear security issues. He has published 7 books on Chinese strategy. He speaks Chinese and Russian and is currently writing a book on China-Russian relations. He holds a BA from Harvard, an MA from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and a PhD from Princeton. Nicholas Gavostev is Professor of National Security Affairs at the U.S. Naval War College. He currently holds non-residential fellowships with the Foreign Policy Research Institute and the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs. He has taught at Baylor, Georgetown, George Washington, Harvard Extension, and Brown Universities. From 2016 to 2020, he served as the Captain Jerome E. Levy Chair in Economic Geography and National Security. Mary Manjikian teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in intelligence, disaster assistance management, national security affairs, and terrorism. She is the author of 2 books on cyber politics and is also a Fulbright scholar. She is a former U.S. Foreign Service officer with service in the Netherlands, Russia, and Bulgaria. Manjikian received her BA in Russian from Wellesley College, a master's in philosophy from Oxford University, and an MA and PhD in political science from the University of Michigan. Lasha Chantaridze is professor and director of the graduate programs in diplomacy and international relations for Norwich University. He is also a Harvard University Davis Center Associate Research Fellow for the Center for Defense and Security Studies at the University of Manitoba, Winnipeg, Canada, and an advisory member of the Peace and War Center here. He earned his PhD in International Affairs from Queen's University, Kingston, Ontario, Canada. Here's the format for today. I'd like to give each of the panelists 2 minutes to give an opening remarks on the topic of U.S.-Russian relations. I've then got 3 or 4 questions for the panel that will take maybe 25, 30 minutes, and then for the rest of the time, we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So let me start by asking Dr. Goldstein if he could and we'll go from then to his left on down the line for 2 minutes or so of opening remarks.
Yes, hi, thank you, and so honored to be here. And you know, I just would say up front that I'm glad we had a moment of silence there. I am appalled by the events of the last 4 weeks, and you know, condemn in the strongest terms what the Kremlin has done. Let me just lay out a couple of ideas here, because I think let you know kind of where my focus is. I think, you know, taking off of what Thomas Graham said yesterday, that for all the moral outrage. Moral outrage probably is not the best way to form up our national security policy going forward. Let me suggest two respects in which that I think is particularly important. And the first is concerning nuclear security. And we heard a very important lecture yesterday from the General Deputy Commander of STRATCOM. And I assure you he chose his words extremely carefully, so you may want to reread your notes there. But the nuclear shadows over this crisis are very considerable. I meant to tell the General this yesterday, but I was just reviewing an article from the January edition of Voyennaya Obozrenia, Military Review in Russian, and this article stated quite emphatically, Russia is many times superior to the U.S. in terms of tactical nuclear weapons. Think about that, folks. We have to be exceedingly careful in this crisis. I'll be glad to tell you more, although I think the General did a fabulous job yesterday in laying out that Russia has absolutely prioritized nuclear weaponry for the last 20 years. Its capabilities are modern and ready to be used. The second thing I say may be more controversial here, but I think it's just worth laying out that I think one of the questions that we were given originally concerned lessons from the Cold War, and one of those lessons is to be exceedingly careful and avoid nuclear crises and nuclear escalation. But another lesson, I think, from the Cold War concerns the spheres of influence as a way to prevent, constant conflict and risk of escalation and war. We can go into that more, but to me, it's been a missing part of the discussion here, and again, we have to keep our emotions in check and think about what is best for the United States. Thank you.
So briefly, a few questions that I think we need to grapple with moving forward. The first is really addressing a question that we have dodged back and forth ever since 1991, which is our problem with Moscow a question of personnel? Is it a question of regime type, or is it a question of Russia as a geopolitical entity? Because how you answer that question has very profound implications for the policies you're going to adopt moving forward. If we think that this is largely a problem created by Putin personally, then if Putin is removed, does that create an opportunity for resetting the relationship? If you're talking about changing a regime, which is talking about really replacing a political and business elite, then you are going to run into the same questions that the United States did not adequately answer in the months after the fall of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, which is how deep, how far do you go, what level of resistance does this engender? And if you're talking about that this is a question of Russia within its essentially how it is composed as a state, as a multinational, imperial, internally colonized, whatever terms you want to use, then the question is that no government in the Kremlin is likely to produce the outcomes that you want, and therefore you are looking at the question of the Russian state. Related to that is the question of finally ending the strategic ambiguity about where Europe ends and the rest of the world begins. Is Russia part of Europe? Is Russia not part of Europe? Is Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, are they Europe? Are they not Europe? Are they sort of Europe? And really beginning to make those decisions. And something that Tom said from the first panel, which I think is absolutely important for policy, is, as we've seen, a lot of talk of support in what Lyle refers to as kind of the moral outrage of what we've seen over the last 4 weeks. Is that going to be sustained into long-term commitments, particularly financial and economic commitments of both the European Union and the United States to make substantive investments, whether it's in containing Russia, rebuilding Ukraine, integrating Eastern Europe into the core of the Euro-Atlantic world. And then finally, the third issue that we have to consider is that the United States for the last 40 years has not wanted to see Russia and China essentially consummate their entente. Have we essentially decided now that we're going to write that off and we don't really have a problem with China being the beneficiary of the Ukraine war in terms of finally securing access to Russia's vast natural resource base and what is still a considerable military technical base as well. That essentially we are prepared. Do we think that this newfound transatlantic and trans-Pacific unity now outweighs any possibility of a Russia-China link-up, or at least of a China being able to absorb that Russian base? Because again, that has profound implications for U.S. policy. Lyle's already raised the nuclear issue, so I'm not going to put that, but I think that's also what we would have to look at.
I won't move. Thank you so much for the invitation. I feel like I've learned so much just myself from interacting with all of you. I just really appreciate the opportunity to be here. As we've talked about kind of NATO expansion over the past day or so, and kind of sort of how Putin may or may not be feeling about the threat of NATO expansion, it seems that we've kind of described NATO largely as a military alliance, and we've described it largely from a realist international relations viewpoint. But I'm going to tell you a little story. In the 1990s, the mid-1990s, so after Angela and I were in Russia, my family moved to Bulgaria, and I was the press attaché, and my husband opened the first security assistance office in Sofia, Bulgaria. And so his job was to bring the Bulgarians into the NATO alliance. And so we'd have all these experts from Washington and Brussels come over, and we'd usually have them over for dinner. And at some point, I said to my husband, how come every second dinner guest is a lawyer? It didn't compute for me. I assumed that mostly he would be thinking about, sort of the interoperability of weapons, whether or not these folks understood the doctrine, whether or not they were getting sufficient English and French training. But as we sort of kind of had these people over and I began to learn, what I realized was in order to bring a nation that's basically coming out of an autocratic past into NATO, the most important things really are issues like civilian control of the military. They brought a lot of people over who basically talked about soldiers' rights. This is how you set up something like a court-martial. These are the rights that your soldiers have. And so kind of what it showed me was that it's a military alliance, but it's so much more than that. It's about rule of law. It's about these big questions, and I wrote them down. How is the military structured? What is the military for, right? If you're the leader of this country, can you use the military to fight your own battles just because you feel like it? How does the military fit into the rest of society? What is transparency? Who's owed information about the military? What do I have to tell other people about the military? And so if you think about this, if you change the role of the military in your society, you fundamentally change your society. And so that's kind of, I guess, the constructivist ideas perspective. And so I think as we think about sort of how Putin and why Putin was threatened by the rise of NATO, don't think about it purely from a realist kind of weapons-based way of sort of what you think an alliance is, because NATO in particular is so much more than that. And then sort of, I'll talk fast. I know I've probably gone over my time. I'm going to put my intel hat on for a minute, and if you're taking notes, write this down. In retrospect, lots of things seemed inevitable. And that's like a really good kind of intel analyst rule. And so that's a question that I found myself thinking about as I think about this conflict is, to some degree, there's sort of this sense of kind of inexorability, isn't it? And you think, well, sort of as we write the story of World War II, we say, of course, Molotov-Ribbentrop wasn't going to work. Of course, appeasement wasn't going to work because it seems so obvious later on, kind of down the road historically. And so if you want to challenge yourself, maybe kind of picture yourself writing the story of this conflict 10 years from now and think to yourself, what in retrospect is going to seem inevitable, right? Is it inevitable that Ukraine is going to join NATO? Maybe we're going to postpone it. Maybe we're going to put it off for a few years. Is it inevitable that NATO is going to split apart? Is it inevitable that whoever replaces Putin is going to be significantly worse? So I'm not going to give you any answers. I'm just going to give you some interesting questions that you might want to play with.
What was the question? Oh, okay. Yes, thank you. Since you're young people here, you're students, so a couple of things you have to remember when you get older and get real jobs and go work in your respective fields of professional occupation. In foreign policy, in diplomacy, when someone is talking to you, you have to somehow force yourself to imagine in their place. Like you have to see the world from their perspective. It's not an easy thing to do. It's very difficult, in fact. And a lot of problems we have now in Ukraine and elsewhere around the world because decision makers, diplomats, politicians fail to do that. They just assume that the world operates like they see the world. It doesn't. The values and the arrangements we have, political arrangements here in the United States or Western Europe, works similarly around the world. It doesn't. It's just say if you study engineering and an engineer comes to you and tells you, I have this very thin cable and it can hold 5 tons of weight. So what do? You ask them, okay, can you demonstrate? Can we see whether that actually works that way? And you go out and try to prove it or disprove it. If it doesn't work, well, maybe there are ways to improve it. And that's how modern science, modern society operates. The benefits you enjoy from this society is based on interaction like that, whether it's biology, chemistry, any field. But unfortunately, in foreign policy, in diplomacy, we use the old language. We use the language of tribalism and warfare. When someone comes to you, tells you, I'm really afraid what you're doing out there, don't do it. The response is, oh, you are imagining it. We are not doing anything significant. You just misunderstand us. And it goes on, this conversation for years between Russia and the West since the mid-1990s. So that's war. That's a language of warfare, of fight, of conflict. And you imagine you do this, you tell this to your girlfriend or your boyfriend over. You know, someone shares his or her concerns with you, and you tell them, you dismiss them. Your relationship is not going to last. You're going to fight every day, and your relationship is going to dissolve. It's the same thing, in relations among countries. So someone tells you they're really afraid of something, or even if you think they're imagining that threat, you have to entertain the idea. Maybe something there. Maybe we can do something to alleviate your fear. Imagining also in case of Russia, speaking about values and our own perception of the world being true everywhere. Civilian leadership over military, Mary just mentioned. Excellent idea here. Very bad idea in Russia. Because normally, Minister of Defense, who is a top military professional in Russia and the former Soviet Union, historically stood between the top decision maker, civilian decision maker, and the nuclear button. Because the military in Russia, people in the uniform, respect the top general, the top guy. They don't respect civilian leader. They don't know who he is. He's the hunting buddy or the fishing buddy of Mr. Putin. And he's incompetent. I'm talking about current Minister of Defense. The previous one was an accountant. So is someone who can prevent nuclear war, a guy who has no influence over his boss's decisions, is a bad idea in Russia. And there are a number of other things that the Russians and other countries have done according to Western standards that have misfired and worked actually to make situation worse. So remember these couple of things. It's very difficult to keep two contradictory ideas in your head and remain sane, but that's what it takes to be a successful decision maker in foreign policy and successful diplomat. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your opening remarks. I'm cognizant that this is both a panel on U.S.-Russian relations that includes, of course, the current conflict in Ukraine, but also other issues, and so I want to ask questions sort of in both areas. To begin with, Dr. Gavostev talked about the importance of framing the conflict, and there are several ways of interpreting the current conflict, the current war with Ukraine. Depending on how you define it, also changes the options that on how best to respond. So, couple possibilities. Is this an ideological conflict between the forces of democracy and autocracy? Is this a conflict about Russian security versus self-determination of its neighbors? Is this a conflict about Russia reestablishing itself as a global power after 3 decades of decline? Is it a conflict about Vladimir Putin himself needing to distract from his own low approval ratings and fear of political instability? Or is this conflict about something else? The question for the panel is how would you frame this war, and therefore what general strategy might the United States employ in response?
Okay, so well, that's a very complicated question. When war happens, and unfortunately in a large-scale war like this, there are many reasons. There is no one single. You cannot boil down it to one thing. People generally look for simple explanations, whether it's the origins of the universe or the complicated questions like this. So war, this particular war entails a lot of things. It encompasses power struggle, the competition for resources. One thing we have to keep in mind that the Russian Federation reached its oil production peak sometime 2019, 2020. Its expanding influence, its self-determination, its historical factors in relation with Ukraine, its current Russian leadership's vision how the world should be, the world order, about new world order. They actually want to topple the existing Pax Americana, American-dominated world order, and create something new. That's why they enjoy support by People's Republic of China, India, Brazil, and others who are also unhappy with this. So there are many aspects to this, and they're not gonna work out as those who are fighting this war envision. The Russian may want something and get something else instead. That may be worse, but a nuclear aspect of this confrontation makes things very difficult and unpredictable, because otherwise the Russian Federation may have signed a peace agreement with Ukraine very similar to what Finland did with the Soviet Union in 1939, when Finland made concessions, didn't win the war, didn't lose the war, made some concessions to the Soviet Union, and the parties, the two sides parted more or less amicably. Russia's possession of nuclear weapons and its belief that it is the strongest military power in the world because it has so many more than 2,500 tactical nuclear warheads, which, by the way, are not treaty weapons. They're outside the treaty because they are not strategic weapons, makes this outcome of this conflict unpredictable.
I'd argue that this war is largely about norms. I think of Russia as a country that's kind of gradually been moving towards behaving like a rogue state in international relations. And in a sense, what we had in 2014 was we had a large-scale norms violation. And we've had those really kind of repeatedly from Russia, whether it was the bombing of Grozny all the way back in the 1990s. And so the question really is, do we have any shared international norms that everyone buys into? Are we an international community? and sort of this question of norms enforcement, right? And I guess norms is an issue that's really close to my heart because I study cyber, and we have these conversations all the time in cyber. What does it mean that we have no norms? And one of the things I always talk to my students about is I say, you know, if you look at the growth of international humanitarian law, it began in the 1500s, right, with chivalry and all that good stuff. And so we have a body of international law that to some degree most of us subscribe to because we built it over 500 years. And then I always say, you know, and we don't have a body of, you know, international humanitarian law having to do with cyber because the internet was invented in like 1994. And so you really can't get those norms in a period of 30 years the way you can in a period of 500 years. But I think that, you know, when we look back kind of historically on this conflict, that's one of the questions that we may ask is sort of, when did sort of the waning of norms and norms enforcement kind of begin? And I kind of feel like militarily, I don't think the United States should wade into providing a no-fly zone. I don't think that NATO should wade into this. I also am extremely worried about escalation. I'm worried about cyber escalating to kinetic. I'm worried about kinetic escalating to nuclear. But there's something to be said for the West somehow taking a stronger stance in terms of saying, yes, we do have norms. We don't bomb buildings that are clearly labeled as having children in them. There are things that we in a civilized society do not do. And there's that concern that if we do not come together as a community to enforce these norms that supposedly we all buy into, I do worry it leaves the door open to China and Taiwan. But I also, it's really tragic if you think about the fact that we've had international humanitarian law for over 500 years, and yet we seem to still have these kind of major aspects of people not respecting it. And it makes you wonder about the future of international humanitarian law. So that's my upbeat answer.
You know, the short answer to your question is it's all of the things that you listed, which makes it difficult to come up with a coherent set of policy responses, because if you decide to say, look, we can make some sort of geopolitical adjustment, but if that's not, you know, but then it doesn't address necessarily the ideological roots of the conflict, of the invasion, the question of norms, so on and so forth, and also the fact that you know, we are grappling with this. We're in this period, this new cycle of adjustment where the system that has emerged after the end of the Cold War, and in fact the world that emerged after the end of the Cold War is changing. Technologically changing, it's changing in terms of environment and climate, it's changing in terms of population and demographics. And you know, I think you have a concern from the US side is we and our allies wrote a lot of the source code of the post-Cold War world, and we're worried about losing the ability to write the source code of the, you know, era that we're entering into. And part of it is the question of norms, part of it, you know, up till February 24th, the sense that Russia and China would be able to write more of that code or push back against us, I think has been a part of it. In policy responses, I mean, one of the things that I'm finding very surprising is the extent to which a number of commentators are very cavalier about the nuclear question, that there really is a generational divide. If you remembered, either you were an adult during the Cold War or you were someone who was dragged to watch the day after when it was on TV in 1983, I think seared a certain worry about nuclear escalation that, frankly, younger generations seem to be more willing to roll the dice on. Either, well, it won't have, I've seen things, well, he won't use them, Russia won't use them, the generals will stop him, which, as Lasha points out, has been eroded, or that they won't work. I've seen that argument too. But that really raises these questions. And I want to bring it back to a point about U.S. domestic policy, which is the bargain we've had since the end of the Cold War domestically in the U.S. is that Washington gets a relatively free hand to intervene as long as the costs do not reach a certain level for the domestic population, which is we don't see our taxes increase, there's no draft, we don't see, and Tom pointed again this point, the gas price as a metric, that I don't have to pay too much at the pump. And so now we are, I think, grappling with not only should we be doing from a systemic norm level and responding, but I think politicians here are also beginning, and Europe as well, are beginning to navigate the question of how much can you ask of your societies and how long will that consensus last. And that has implications. Do we go in and try to, essentially say, I've heard people revive the old patent line, right? Well, let's just settle it now, right? Let's not, let's go in and just, fight it out with Russia and settle this once and for all. Of course, with the nuclear question being diminished, or do we, do you fight to the last Ukrainian, which is, Ukraine, you're doing a great service for the West, and we'll be happy to provide you with as many tools as you need to do the fight, but we're not going to get involved. Do we encourage a settlement? Does the United States, Europe, China all come together and do what the United States did at Dayton to end the Yugoslav wars, which is you come in and you impose a settlement from the outside that none of the parties are particularly happy with, but which, ends the fighting. And right now, I don't, just looking at our own domestic politics, I don't see, I see a lot of concern about how this plays out in the November elections and other things. I don't know that the U.S. has, a complete free hand domestically to be able to address this. And then again, the longer term question of what is the U.S.-Russia relationship going to look like? Are we foreclosing the dream? And Mary, you talked about it, and others about we wanted a better relationship with a different type of Russia in the 90s. Are we just going to write that off and move forward and consolidate the Euro-Atlantic world? And how does this play out with China, with India? I mean, the point is that this issue is just so interconnected with so many other fundamental questions about what the U.S. role is going to be in the world. And if we don't have a domestic consensus, as we did during the Cold War, about what we're prepared to do, what costs we're willing to pay, we're just going to be tinkering at the margins, or we're going to ricochet from administration to administration and party to party, and that's not a good position for having an enduring grand strategy.
Yeah, I would echo what has been said, that this is an immensely complex conflict. But I think probably, we have to, understand this as Putin's war. He didn't, dream this up in 2 weeks, as has been said. He's really been preparing for this for years, if not decades. So how do we understand his motives? I think that is kind of the heart of the question. And here I would say that, on the one hand, you have, what amounts to a kind of very, very dangerous, noxious nationalist ideology. By the way, Russia's not the only country with such, narratives that develop into policy. The fact that a certain type of regime, so these, he doesn't meet, he doesn't interact with many liberals. And this probably has a lot of historical kind of overtones. We understand he is interested in history, let's say more than a little, and has a kind of romantic viewpoint of Slavic brethren coming together. And I think in the back of his mind, he thinks Russia is a powerful country, but could be so much more powerful with Ukraine hitched to the Russian wagon, that all those resources and brilliant people in Ukraine can serve a greater goal. Which is his dream. Of course, that's very unlikely to happen, especially now. But look, on the other side of this, and I think we have to say it, and here I think I disagree with some of my colleagues at the conference, but to me, NATO is part of these motives, a kind of fear of NATO, a loathing of NATO. I have very little doubt about that. And I think there's plenty of evidence, just go through Putin's speeches, going back more than a decade. But it's deeper than that. I've monitored NATO activities in Ukraine for over the decade, and I could tell you some details there. But to me, it was really excessive, and maybe the worst of all worlds, that it didn't have a very strong warfighting component, but it kind of hinted at such components. And I'll just give you an example. I mean, by the way, there were almost continuous set of exercises. So one group of Americans would go in and then come out, and then another would go in. So it was, you know, in other words, you could claim there was no NATO base there, but it was continuous set of NATO exercises in Ukraine. But it was deeper than that. It was actual military infrastructure. And one example I'm very familiar with is the port of Odessa, which has been in the news. Your taxpayer money was funding a very fundamental upgrade of those piers. Why? What does that matter? Well, you upgrade the piers to standards to take NATO warships. You know, and the Russians could see this trend of like more and more NATO warships coming into the Black Sea, and indeed using Odessa as a major spot. And I believe in his speech right before the war, he mentioned the kind of a NATO ops center that was, I don't know if it's officially NATO, but an operations center for maritime operations right near Odessa. So I'm just saying, to my estimate, and if we could go deeper and talk about Putin's assessment of Odessa generally, but I mean, in my view, this is waving a red flag in front of a bull. And was very poorly thought out. So, I mean, you know, we have to be, look, you know, Putin deserves full responsibility for this war, but as Americans, I think we better be honest with ourselves and realize that this was we made some major mistakes here. And by the way, I would just say, I've heard some things at this conference that, you know, I find a little bit disturbing, this kind of, you know, actually Putin may be Hitler, turns out. I don't accept that. I think that's really quite a vast exaggeration of the threat. And as Americans, we need to be realistic, not emotional, and have a very, you know, objective assessment of the facts. Thank you.
Thank you. In my foreign policy classes, we talk about two equations that don't have an equal sign. Power doesn't always equal influence. And secondly, that what a nation sees at stake does not necessarily mean that a proportional response is the best if the resulting cost might be too high. So if you were playing Joe Biden's national security advisor, you're getting a lot of advice, particularly from folks who may not be in decision-making authority and who can be therefore kind of loose in terms of what they would suggest that you do. But if you were Joe Biden's national security advisor, there's been talk of creating, as some of you mentioned, a no-fly zone, of escalating the types and amounts of weapons that could be sent, including MiG fighter jets, and enhanced economic sanctions. Yet you also fear crossing some kind of bright line that Putin has in his head that might escalate Russia's tactics and munitions choices, or even lead to a direct attack on NATO territory. So what should President Biden do to straddle this line between giving enough aid to Ukraine but not too much?
Okay, yeah, great question. And frankly, I'm a little surprised we haven't discussed no-fly zone at all. It seems to me that that really is the kind of the elephant in the room here. But before that, I just want to mention quickly, I mean, we need to, you know, there is some good news here. There's been a lot of bad news, but there's a little bit of good news here, right? The Europeans are stepping up. This is fundamentally good news for the United States. I mean, I would say for decades, really, the United States, in a way, has been honestly taken to the cleaners by European allies where we, you know, spent all the money and did a lot of the fighting, and they, you know, spent tiddlywinks on defense, to put it candidly. That's been very disappointing and had all kinds of deleterious results that I can talk about. But you know, I'm very pleased that Europeans are seeing this as a, you know, it is first and foremost a European problem. If they think that Putin is about to march on Berlin, I don't think he is, but if they are concerned about that, then they should, you know, and in, you know, I think any rational country right now wouldn't take a chance and would build up. And here, you know, what Germany is doing is probably prudent, but I would like to see much more. I would like to see, you know, greater integration. And countries all, you know, why should they just spend 2%? Maybe they should come up to 2.5% or something like that. By the way, I didn't mention before, NATO aggregate spending versus Russia, defense spending, 20 times what Russia spent, 20 times. So, you know, there's room for the Europeans, I think, to do much more. although it probably shouldn't be excessive either. Okay, let me come to the no-fly zone, sorry. Very quickly, I think it's a horrible idea. I think we had better think very carefully about ways in which U.S. and Russia or U.S. and NATO would come into combat, and there are many other ways besides the no-fly zone, but to me this is hugely risky, and I consider it I'll just end by saying those of us who follow nuclear strategy like I do, we will like to keep the chance of nuclear war well below 1% and maybe even below 0.1%, right? Folks, we are nowhere near there right now. We are like, maybe the general would put a better number on it, but I'm afraid we're crossing 10%. Okay, we do not want to be here. And unfortunately, the major scenario that I see, and by the way, I can give you a citation to, actually, Nick and I were both there at Naval War College. We did a study on this, it's actually published online, but it says pretty clearly that Russia unlikely to resort to nuclear weapons unless the regime is threatened by something that happens on the battlefield. We may be about to see that. And as has been discussed, Russia has plenty of tactical nuclear weapons to use. We could talk about what the targets would be. We could talk about what the U.S. response would be. But I am very concerned about this, and a no-fly zone is one clear pathway to get there. So we had better avoid that. Thank you.
Building on what Lyle said, I think, and we've already seen the administration, I think, do this, and of course has suffered a lot of, it's easy to carp from the sidelines and to call for things that aren't going to happen because you want to score political points. And I think we've seen that with some of these calls for no-fly zones, because it's really easy to posture to say, well, I wanted to have a much stronger response. It's safe in the knowledge it's not going to happen. One of the things with that, too, again, a lot of the commentary is all over the map, because technically a no-fly zone is about keeping aircraft out of the air. What a lot of people have in mind when they're talking about a no-fly zone for Ukraine is what happened in Libya, which is you're using your aircraft to strike targets on the ground. You're looking to do a no-drive zone, a no-artillery zone, and we should then just be, upfront if what you're saying is that the United States or NATO, and NATO can only do this with the concurrence of its 30 members, wants to become a co-belligerent, then that's a realm, but just be open about it. And I think one of the things that the Biden administration has been doing is to really strip away ambiguity, is to be very clear and not to play fast and loose with terms. That, if we want to be a co-belligerent, we could be a co-belligerent, but not to use some sort of antiseptic term that the public thinks carries no risk for Americans or for Europeans. I think making it very clear that, yes, for these years we've played fast and loose with terms like ally, and it's been one of my pet peeves. Regretfully, Ukraine is not an ally of the United States. Ally does not mean we like you, does not mean you're our friend. An ally legally means we have a binding arrangement, a treaty obligation to do things for each other. Ukraine does not have any such agreement. The Budapest Memorandum is a memorandum. It's not even an executive agreement. And the Office of Legal Counsel weighed in on this in 2014, said this is not a binding, nothing in this memorandum is binding on the United States. We do not have a bilateral defense treaty. We do not have, Ukraine's not even been raised to the status of a major non-NATO ally, which the president can do at the stroke of a pen. Any president since 1994 could have designated Ukraine a major non-NATO ally, and that has not happened. And I think what you now have, and people are critical of, is we have this, well, and I used to hear this at the Loisac group and others, well, but there are virtual allies. Ukraine is a virtual ally, and they should be covered under a virtual Article 5. That's not how it works. And I think that the president has been very clear about, yes, there is NATO territory, and that we are prepared to escalate, to defend if there is an incursion. We will have the full range, but we're not going to kind of operate in this degree of strategic ambiguity about, well, you're sort of NATO or the like. This also has obligations, but I think the president has been very clear on this and the people around him. Everyone knows Article 5. I have a nice point I like to raise on Twitter, which is, first rule of NATO Fight Club, you actually have to know what's in the treaty. everyone quotes Article 5 and think this means you go to war. That's not what Article 5 says. It just simply says you consult and take the measures you see fit to respond to an armed attack. And then you have little problems like Article 8, which means that if, say, Poland decides it wants to get involved in Ukraine, which is Poland's sovereign right to do so, it can't rely on the alliance, because Article 8 says you can't take steps that essentially create international obligations for the rest of the alliance if the rest of the alliance has not agreed to that. Now again, if all 30 members of the alliance meet in Brussels and say, we will use, and you can use Article 4, we have a threat to peace and security in Europe, we all agree as the 30 that NATO will do this. But again, these are levels of diplomatic action, and you have to hold, again, NATO is like the old Polish sim is, liberum veto. One NATO country can say, we don't want to do this, and that's it. What should we be doing forward? I think Israeli Prime Minister Bennett got a very bad rap. I think people misinterpreted his advice to President Zelensky, which was not to surrender, but essentially is get the fighting stopped now. Get a ceasefire. Every day this goes on, the damage that is done to Ukraine is irreparable. Ukraine was already the poorest country in Europe. Moldova actually went ahead of Ukraine. So Moldova is no longer the poorest country in Europe, it's Ukraine. There's a lot of reconstruction that's going to happen. Get a ceasefire, put some things on the table, and also let things take their course. If this war, which I personally think has done a major piece of damage to Russian power, get a ceasefire now, and then let kind of the process of what's happening in Russia play itself out in a way that may be very different a year or 2 years from now. So, and again, I think you're seeing the administration quietly encouraging the process Turkey is doing. The administration officially, not people on Twitter, but the administration has not poo-pooed anything Israel has been trying to do to get the two together. We've even cautiously said, look, if China wants to play a role in mediating, we would welcome that, and I think that that's good advice. Getting this, getting the fighting stopped, and this is, again, we're back to the Dayton model. A lot of people didn't like the Dayton Accords, but the one great benefit of the Dayton Accords is that 0 people have died in Bosnia as a result of fighting since 1995. So, if nothing else from just the basic right to life question, I think pushing for a cessation of hostilities, even if it doesn't give you the emotional satisfaction of marching into the Kremlin, frog marching Putin to The Hague, and raising the blue and gold flag over the Kremlin, which I don't think But you're seeing people advocate that, right? This war cannot end until you have a battleship Missouri surrender. I think would be very bad for Ukraine, and over time runs the risk that this conflict gets out of hand.
If I were speaking with the president, the first thing I would urge him to do would be to clarify his objectives. I think if we know anything from history, it's that wandering into a conflict without being exactly sure of what it is that you want to accomplish is a very bad idea. And so the questions that I think we really need to be asking, sort of whether we're in leadership or whether we're just kind of the population, is if the United States, either unilaterally or with NATO, were to get more deeply involved in Ukraine, what would be the specific objectives? How would we measure whether or not we had actually met those objectives, and what would be the plan for leaving once we had? I think those are questions that they're good questions to ask. And what concerns me is, you kind of alluded to that, when you hear people talk about kind of what the U.S. quote unquote should do, there seems to be kind of this very broad set of objectives. Would the point of the U.S. going into this conflict, be the same as the U.S. marching all the way to Baghdad and getting rid of Saddam Hussein? I mean, is what we're talking about, deposing Putin? Are we talking about getting Russia as a revanchist power to change its policy preferences? Are we talking about getting Russia as a revanchist power to change its behavior? Or are we talking about something on a much smaller scale, like maybe tomorrow no one will die in Ukraine? Because those are very, very different objectives. And so I think the first thing we really need to get a handle on is what exactly it would be that we would be attempting to accomplish if we were to wade further into this. And I don't think there is a consensus in American society. There's not a consensus, I think, in the Senate and Congress. I don't think there's a consensus in the media. And so that would be the first thing, would really be to sort of clarify the problem before you attempt to solve it. In terms of risks, one thing I just want to mention is we talk a lot about this risk of something escalating to nuclear, but I have been really interested by this sort of suggestion that someone floated that the ICANN, the International Consortium for the Assignment of Network Names, basically the people who kind of built and control the internet, it's supposed to be international, but kind of like the UN, the US pays all the bills, it's located in the United States. I think it actually has an office in Brussels as well. But there's been this discussion about, let's cut .ru off from the root directory and basically disconnect them from the internet. And in terms of, and people kind of like it because it's something you can do. You can't sort of halfway achieve it. It's something you fully achieve, and maybe there won't even be any bloodshed. It's just something that you do. But I think the other issue we really need to think about is the idea of having, basically going back to a Soviet Union that's inscrutable, right? That whole sort of Churchill, a riddle wrapped in an enigma. The idea that we're going to be back to sort of looking at pictures and trying to figure out who's sitting next to who at the October Revolution military parade. I don't think that's something we want to do. And so the question is also going to be sort of how do we accomplish whatever objective maybe we finally agree upon in a way that we're not going to get Russia to sort of, and that's why we shouldn't cut them off from the internet, by the way, is we don't want to have a Russia where we honestly have no idea what's taking place in there. The idea that it could be sort of completely irrational and unpredictable. I think that's really a scary risk that we need to think about.
If I were advising President of the United States, I would suggest that he resign. I'm serious. I fully understand these kinds of suggestions wouldn't go well in the White House, but I think the situation is serious enough to ask Mr. Biden to resign and hand over to Mrs. Harris. Mrs. Harris is an enigma for the Russian decision makers. They don't know her very well. Mr. Biden has been studied very well due to his long service and his connection with Ukraine, his son's connection with Ukraine. Besides, he also burned bridges with Mr. Putin, and he has zero influence and respect in the Russian leadership. And also, let's remember that the current Russian leadership comes from old Soviet misogynistic culture, which does not understand women. They are apprehensive of women. And if Mrs. Harris too were put an act that she is aggressive, not towards Mr. Putin, but towards her staff, people around her, she is unpredictable. She throws tantrum here and there. Putin will get a message. No one wants someone to order 10 megaton bombs to drop over Moscow. And if you're facing someone who you cannot understand, is aggressive, unpredictable, you may want to slow down. Okay, so, and the fact that when Mr. Putin announced war, invasion of Ukraine, and warned the United States to stay away or face the worst day of in your history, and actually threatened us with nuclear retaliation. That message was taped 2 days prior, and he ended that section of his message by telling us that I have already given orders to my forces, relevant orders. So that tells you that he's cautious. He still The reason he taped it, because if you tell me you're going to attack me with nuclear forces, you call for a first strike from my side. So the only thing I have left now is to attack you, because the first strike is most likely win this kind of war. But he was being cautious, he prepared, he taped it, he got his forces ready, then he told us. So that suggests he's being cautious still. And he does not want unpredictable reaction by the United States. So that would be the best option for us right now, but as you well understand.
You all in the audience have been very patient. Let me ask folks who have questions to come down to either of the two microphones for the time remaining. And if you could identify yourself before you ask the question, that would be great. Thank you. And we can start on this side of the room.
Is it on? There we go.
Yes.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Cadet Rory Stewart, and my question pertains more to kind of our young generation of students in the audience that are aspiring diplomats. So in reference to this sort of crisis, what strategy or what useful asset do we have to sort of handle these conflicts for the future, and what lessons can we learn to take this step forward to kind of create a career where we're setting ourselves up for success for potential crises in the future, or even to take over when we kind of move into that professional world?
I guess I'd urge you to learn Russian. I think that, again, one thing that we do see is that I personally view this as an intelligence failure. I think that we did sort of have some wrong information about Russian objectives, about Russian assets, and I think it's just really important for people to still learn foreign languages. I know there's a tendency for everybody your age, I have 3 kids your age, to want to be very careerist and think about, what specifically is going to get me a job, but it's still really, really useful to understand a culture. I think one thing that maybe you got out of this whole conference is history matters, right? We kind of pretended for a long time that it didn't, but we've heard people make references over the last couple of days to 1939 and Ivan the Terrible. The idea that sort of we do need to understand our adversaries, we need to understand their history, we need to speak their language, and just learn more about sort of the process of diplomacy itself. Something that I find myself thinking about, is if, God forbid, 10 years from now, Russia looks like North Korea, what do diplomats do in that situation? Do we have exchanges, and how do you talk to people who are very different than yourselves? What do confidence building measures look like for neighbors that don't trust each other? And I think really kind of sometimes there's a tendency to, particularly if you want to be a diplomat, to be really, really interested in like American foreign policy. But it's also really, really important to know those enemies and to know your neighbors as well.
Yeah, I would just underline that as well. I mean, to focus on history, focus on languages, absolutely. I mean, can't say that enough. And by the way, new technology. I speak a couple of languages. But I was never talented at languages. But these new technologies. I mean, if you want to sit all day and watch Russian TV or Chinese TV or whatever, here in Vermont, you can do that. That didn't exist when we were studying. So you have a lot of advantages and take advantage, and your skills will help our country in these circumstances. But one other thing I would say is that, diplomacy going forward and how does our State Department work and so forth. First of all, it's vastly under-resourced, and U.S. diplomats are an incredible asset to our country, but I fear we have most of them stamping passports, which, we should be using their skills in a much wiser way. I would throw on there, lately, over the last decades, our diplomats seem to be, we got to look on the website for what our policy is, just have a meeting, read our talking points, and that's pretty much what you want to do. To me, that's not diplomacy. Diplomacy is give and take. It involves not just sticks and threats, it involves carrots. I mean, look at this meeting with Biden and Xi. The headlines, at least, were all, here are the 10 ways we're going to punish China if they dare to help Russia. Maybe we should have turned it around, said, how can we improve U.S.-China relations? And maybe that will have the effect that we actually want. So building incentives to cooperate. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. How you doing? My name is Cadet Lorenz Simpkins. And earlier, I believe it was you, Dr. Goldstein, spoke about, I think you used the analogy, the red flag in front of the bull for some of the actions that precipitated Russian actions in Ukraine. Do you think that, and then you later spoke about, obviously, our NATO partners having an increased level of activity and funding in NATO. Do you think that the increase in activity and funding of these NATO partners, could that not serve to exacerbate that red flag in front of the bull issue? Or do you think that the United States taking maybe a step back in terms of influence and control over NATO would actually allow, kind of mitigate those impacts?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I'll just give you another example of the red flag, by the way. There are ballistic missile defense radars that we put up in Poland and Romania. And by the way, every year the Russians would come back and say, you cannot do this. This is really destabilizing. And we know how much the Russians care about their nuclear deterrent, I mean, to some crazy degree. So no matter how we assured them that those radars are actually pointed at Iran, nothing to do with you, do you think they really believe that? So in retrospect, I think that was a huge mistake, another example of waving that red flag. And sure, they thought next we were going to build one of those in Ukraine, although you don't really need to because the ones back there were so important. But I mean, as far as I think, look, NATO increased European expenditures. That's definitely good for the U.S. I guess it allows us to focus on the Pacific, which has been our kind of strategy. By the way, the Indo-Pacific strategy published right. I think the day before the war began, so it didn't get much attention. So that's good. But you raise an interesting point. Could that make it worse? Could Germany doubling its defense funding just exaggerate all those Russian fears? And I think we have to be sensitive to that. It's but one bit of confidence I have is Americans. We're kind of let's say we don't focus on generally don't focus on Ukraine, don't focus on Romania. Most Americans would have no idea where Moldova is, for example. Europeans do know these things. They know the details. They know the history. They follow these issues extremely closely, and they also know a lot of Russians, and they're aware of Russian sensitivities. So this is why part of U.S. policy should be empower the Europeans to take their security in their own hands. They should be managing the negotiations, not relying on the United States to do it. Actually, if you review the diplomacy of the last 4 months, right before the war, could a deal have been made? I happen to think a deal could have been made. But part of it was this kind of tossing the football between Berlin and Paris and Rome and sending it back to the U.S. The Americans will handle it. This is a recipe for a disaster, which we have. The Europeans should lead on European security.
Let me just touch base, though, on, and this goes back to the question about diplomacy as well, about knowing your carrots, your sticks, what you're prepared to do, the level of creativity, because Lyle, on the one you're talking, and the Russians I think had some genuine security concerns. I mean, Ukraine has genuine security concerns too, and I think if we had linked the training that we were doing towards creating, moving Ukraine towards armed neutrality, right? A neutrality that doesn't depend upon the goodwill of your neighbors, but you can enforce it. And we had a path in terms of what Azerbaijan has been doing. Azerbaijan has been officially neutral since 2012, but has a very robust military, has very robust capabilities that makes challenging them raises a cost. We could have explored those options. We didn't. All of this talk about airspace. We could have said that as part of a Ukrainian neutrality deal, NATO countries will operate air defense facilities on the border with Poland and Hungary, which would give you coverage over most of Ukrainian airspace, but could not then touch the Russian security bubble. By the way, we did this with Cyprus. This was the Cyprus deal of 1997, when Cyprus was buying air defense equipment, and Turkey said this will allow Cyprus to target jets in Turkish airspace. So those systems were moved to Crete, so they can cover Cyprus, but can't touch Turkey. This, though, goes back to diplomacy. It means that you have to be able to sell this. You have to be able to get people to sign on a dotted line when they say, well, I want full membership in NATO, right? So that was Ukraine's push after 2014, and Russia was never no membership in NATO. And also, finally, on your point there, I think, which is very important, Lyle, my understanding is that then that last week of talks between Scholz, Macron, and Putin, one of the hang-ups was Putin saying to Scholz and Macron, and the Americans are on board with this, and Scholz and Macron saying we can't guarantee that the Biden administration will agree to any of this. And so Putin's saying, fine, let the cannon decide, as the saying goes, because why am I talking to you when I should be just talking to Joe Biden? One last thing on diplomacy, which is, again, goes back to domestic politics. U.S. still does not have a Senate-confirmed ambassador in Kiev. We've not had one since 2019. It's 2022. So, it's great that all these members of Congress have their blue and yellow on, and yet for some reason we can't get a nomination through the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So, again, domestic politics and domestic consensus on this matters. So you have a U.S. diplomat in Kiev who is not technically the personal representative of the president and does not enjoy the confidence of the Senate to be able to be in that position. And as far as I know, even with the war going on, there is no move to expedite getting an ambassador in Kiev. So just leave it there.
Good morning. I'm Cadet Corporal Thomas Harwood. My question is just generally for the panel. What do you think the implications of recent events are on U.S. foreign policy in the sense of interventionism, like in foreign conflict?
Take a stab, start with that. This comes after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, right? And then there's been, how does that fit in the idea of a 20-year mission to reshape a society that essentially ended with the U.S. packing up and leaving, and raising questions about the efficacy of American power to intervene and to reshape, and that a number of months later you have, well, the United States should be prepared to intervene militarily in a conflict with a nuclear armed power. So I think that it speaks to a real question about, and this goes back to questions about narrative, it goes back to questions about what are the goals and objectives, what are you trying to do. I think we have a sense that intervention still really is something that doesn't cost the U.S. anything. Right? We can intervene, and again, the last 20 years, to be frank, the United States made major mistakes, had major setbacks that didn't really impact the domestic lives of Americans, right? There's no sense that having more or less not succeeded as we wanted to in Iraq, having left Afghanistan, that there's any domestic. The problem is that if we're moving into an era of state-on-state competition with actors who have, just one thing about the Russia-Ukraine war is showing that Ukraine, which is a middle power, Ukraine is not Afghanistan. You have these people expressing these things about, well, the Russians are taking all these losses and America only took so many losses in Afghanistan. The Taliban had no air force, had no air defense capabilities, had no tank productions, had no, this is state-on-state war between what we would think of as a great power, but what is a middle power. And there are costs. And I think Americans have not internalized that even a short clash with a middle power is going to probably have costs that most Americans have not thought of. If anyone has read Stavridis and Ackerman's 2034, his novel of the next World War, which starts off with Americans being shocked at losing a carrier in the South China Sea and what impact that has on Americans. Wait a minute, we lost a carrier? You know, not just a few people here and there in a roadside bomb attack. I think we haven't gotten there yet. So you have people saying, well, we can do a no-fly zone because what's going to happen? How many planes did we lose in the Iraqi no-fly zones? Right? And so we're still thinking, okay, one reason why General Milley didn't want to do the no-fly zone over Syria is he said, I can guarantee we're going to start losing aircraft, Mr. President, and then 2 days later you're going to be under pressure once American pilots are being paraded on Syrian TV to get us out of there. I don't know that we have a social understanding of the risks of what it would take to do some of these interventions, because we spread out the costs of Afghanistan. The individual cost on Americans was spread out over 20 years. Yeah. So, and I worry too, this is also what I call the Call of Duty effect. Right? I mean, when you play a lot of Call of Duty, it's, just seems like, hey, let's just go in there and, we'll just kick some, and with no cost. But, again, this is, as the Russians are finding out in Ukraine, this isn't a video game. And I don't know that we've reached a social level yet that says we're willing to lose 5,000, 10,000 people in an intervention within a matter of weeks or months.
It's always It's always interesting, I think, to think about kind of buzzwords that you hear used by diplomats, and then maybe a couple years later you say, whatever happened to whatever that term was that everybody was throwing about? Well, responsibility to protect. Remember R2P, that if this conflict had occurred 10 years ago or 20 years ago, it would have been all about R2P, right? There wouldn't even have been any other discussion. The idea that sort of, a major power has a responsibility to intervene in a situation where genocide is taking place. And the whole thing with R2P was kind of like, this is not negotiable, this is not debatable, this is the way we understand the issue. And so something that it points to is kind of the expiration of that understanding that we're compelled, we're morally compelled, and that there's a consensus. Talking about the risk as we talk about it now is certainly a very different conversation than that R2P conversation.
Well, maybe just one quick comment on there, and here I'm borrowing an idea I heard Nick Gavostev say a week ago when he spoke at Brown, but one thing the Ukrainians are illustrating is how, highly motivated people with even some pretty simple weapons are able to defend their homes, and it's incredible, actually, to behold, really. But I mean, that in a way that gives some hope that, that perhaps we are entering an era where even a great power seemingly able to just trounce its neighbor, but maybe not. In other words, small, medium countries have hope of reasonable defense, and that can allow the U.S. to not be try to, let's face it. After reviewing the last 30 years, we have, as my colleague said, made a lot of mistakes. Certainly intervened too much, put a little too much faith in the use of force. So I think we need to go to another model where force is truly a last resort. We make sure that stick is very big and strong, but we hardly ever use it, and only use it when it's absolutely necessary. That's I think the preferred approach. And this, I think letting people defend themselves, maybe giving them the tools here and there, but we can see that sometimes that works better, and Russia is severely chastised and may indeed lose a lot. So the Ukrainians are teaching the Russians a lesson, if you will.
Thank you. We have time for one more question.
Hello, everyone. Sergeant Corey Orfant. Thank you all for coming here and fielding our questions. So we hear a lot of talk about, no-fly zones and hammer them with more sanctions, things of that nature, but trying to think outside of the box when you're looking at diplomacy. Often just trying to prove one's right and one's wrong is not always effective, but if you're able to provide someone with a back door, so to speak, a way to step down and still feel as though they have won the argument, right? Is there a way in which we could set that stage? And by we, I mean whomever in the world is able to do that. And B, is there an entity or person who would be able to reasonably help to broker that deal?
I'm thinking that's a Lyle question. It's all about the Asian idea of saving face, isn't it?
Well, thank you, Mary. You set me up well. I mean, I've always been a fan of this kind of diplomacy of off-ramps. I think it's critically important. I mean, in the nuclear era, you know, our presidents, you know, Kennedy told us not to be afraid to negotiate. And indeed, you know, not everybody knows it, but the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I urge all students of national security to review in great detail. By the way, note that probably the most dangerous elements of that crisis were whether tactical nuclear weapons would be employed. I interviewed a former Soviet submarine captain who had literally his trigger finger on a tactical nuclear torpedo that would have, you know, taken out our amphibious group, and we didn't even know about it. Just saying, these elements are so important. So what is that off-ramp, which in the Cuban Missile Crisis was the trade of the Turkish, the missiles in Turkey. So, you know, you have to kind of give face. And the second, you know, who can mediate? I think that was part of the question too, is, you know, I think that's such an important question. And Nick Gavostev brought up the example of the Israelis. I think that, you know, that should be fully supported. There are other countries too. I think China, you know, imagine China and Israel working on this together. I mean, if you will, two opposites, but two countries that know a thing or two about military affairs. China has a very wide experience with UN peacekeeping. People don't realize, but peacekeepers, I think, are part of the solution. And I love Nick Gvozdev's idea of using the Dayton model. That's, to me, I think some good student papers can come out of this, even in this spring.
I just want to introduce a note of pessimism, though. I've been talking with some colleagues in D.C., and one trend that they find worrying is what they're calling the Saddam Husseinization of Putin, that there was a point at which Saddam Hussein, after 1991, was just beyond the pale. You couldn't negotiate with him. You could try to box him in and contain him, but, you know, he was considered beyond the pale. And the question is whether or not Putin has reached that level. That, you know, no longer, we're not going to, the Ukrainian, well, President Zelensky says he still wants to meet face to face with him, but, you know, in the U.S. political context, have we crossed the Rubicon where, having sort of set up a certain thing, you can't then say, well, now we can have an agreement and we can back away? And no, it will require, we have to deal with someone else. And again, this is why my advice, the longer this goes on, the harder it is to walk back from statements and positions that, you know, you've taken. And, you know, this is on all sides, by the way. This isn't just that we're waiting for, you know, is Putin Putin has offered no off-ramps of his own, right? He had the ability to offer off-ramps, which he has chosen not to do because he's continued to insist on a maximalist agenda. So, you know, that's an issue. But the Saddam, if Putin moves into full Saddam, and this is why leaving aside the Hitler comparison, I think the Saddam Hussein one is actually more relevant from a policy perspective, because then there is a point at which you say we cannot end this, we can try to containment breaks down, and you're just left with all of this in limbo. And, you know, what that means for the world economy. If you freeze today, you just throw these couple points out, you freeze the lines they are today with no settlement, and you look at what the impact, I mean, there's going to be people going hungry around the world this summer because Ukrainian food exports won't be occurring. And then longer term, you want climate change things. I mean, Russia was supposed to play a role with nuclear and hydrogen. Now all that's off, and everyone's back to discovering that they're going to burn coal again. And so, yeah, there's, again, if we Saddam Husseinize this approach, it's not just the geopolitics, but you're talking about impacts on climate, environment, demography, economics. Yeah.
So, a couple takeaways. This event could be the 9/11 of your generation in terms of foreign policy. And it could replace the Cuban Missile Crisis for scholars of a foreign policy 30, 40 years from now in studying how to escalate and de-escalate tensions. Diplomacy is an art and a science, and compromise is not a dirty word. Always think about relations between nations from other nations' perspectives and their interests as well as your own. Domestic politics and public opinion in a democracy can be both a help and a hindrance in solving foreign policy crises. Conflicts can be easily started, but ending them is arduous, slow, and messy. And finally, hindsight, all things are clear and clean. 30 years from now, this will be a couple paragraphs in a textbook on U.S. foreign policy. With that, I'd like to thank our panelists, if we could give them a round of applause. And now a couple words from Dr. Koo.
Dr. Rollybrook, and thank you so much for your just nice management of these great panel discussions. So today, we had just a lot of talks and discussions and debates and question and answers. So I think if I remember correctly, 2017, Dr. Travis Morris and I, we had a vision to have Peace and War Summit. So at the time we decided the topic, the first topic was North Korean nuclear and missile challenges. And then just at the time we thought about the Chinese, US-China rivalry. And then Russian topic we chose. So 5 years ago, all these topics were in our thoughts. But thankfully, not thankfully actually, unfortunately, Russian invasion of Ukraine happened, and then suddenly it became a big topic and controversial topics. So over the last 2 days, we were able to promote our understanding of this very important issue and just the global challenges we are currently facing. So hopefully, all of us can broaden our perspective, especially future leaders. You can embrace not only the United States, but also the whole world, in which there are so many difficult challenges and problems and issues, ranging from the Africa and Latin America, Europe, Asia, India, China, and everywhere. So hopefully all of you can play significant role in preventing this kind of conflict from taking place. If that happens, you can play amazing role in handling, making reconciliation, and resolving the historical dispute and all those kinds of conflicts in the amazing ways. Thank you so much. And next year, 2023, March 20th and 21, we're going to have fourth Peace and War Summit, which addresses the topic of Iran and the Middle Eastern issues. See you next March. Have a nice day. Thank you so much for your participation and active attendance in this summit.